Hi, everybody. We're so excited to have you here today. So just before we get started, so I guess welcome to Paperless Learning webinar. Before we get started, we just wanted to introduce ourselves. So my name is Jinan, and the reason I'm here today is because I online teach in the mornings, and I've also been an online tutor for a very long time. So I know how difficult remote teaching and remote learning can be for both parties, students and teachers alike. And currently I work with paper, so here we are.
To introduce myself, my name is Lisa. I've been a classroom teacher for the past about 5, 6 years now. So I'm definitely in the same boat for you, where going from the classroom to online could seem very daunting, but we're all in this together and here to support each other. I'm also now working for paper as well, and super excited to have you folks here and to talk about how to lesson plan for online.
So before we get into it, or while we're giving you some tips on how to lesson plan, feel free to message us in the chat. You can either choose to message all panelists or all panelists and attendees. So you can tell us a little bit where you're from, what your position is, and what brings you here today. And also, we have a Q&A function as well. So the Q&A is there for if you want to ask any questions that we will be answering at the end. So the chat is more for live interaction, and the Q&A will be answered at the end of the chat at the end of the webinar if you have any questions. So, we have some new attendees. So just quickly, I'm Janan.
I'm Lisa.
Great, and welcome to the Paperless Learning webinar. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. And also, as we go on, feel free to write in the chat where you're from and what your education is. I'm repeating myself for the newcomers.
Great. So here we have Samantha that we want to introduce you to. Samantha is an elementary school ELA teacher. She had the rest of her year planned out. She had figured out all her lessons, all her units. She spent lots of extra hours planning everything. She was really on top of it, and she was feeling very confident that this was going to pay off for her by the end of the year. And then, unfortunately, as we all know, everything with coronavirus and COVID-19 started to happen, and her school switched from being in the physical realm to distance learning and remote teaching. And so Samantha was feeling a little bit stressed, as I'm sure a lot of us are, and she was not quite sure what she should do with her plans and her assessments and everything she had figured out. So we're going to start to go into that a little bit now and talk about what Samantha could and should do.
So we want to hear what you folks think would be best. So I'm going to launch a poll here. So you should have gotten a little pop-up. So please let us know what you think Samantha should do next now that she has to work from home. What should she do with her lesson plan? Just going to give a few moments. All right, so we have a few votes in. I'm going to stop it here so we can get going. Anyways, we've all said the same thing. It's pretty straightforward. We do have to make adjustments. So let's see, what is that going to look like? So as we know, moving from a physical setting to a virtual one comes with very big changes. And with these changes comes adaptations. So we will absolutely need to adapt Samantha's lessons to suit a remote teaching and learning environment.
So all of this can seem very daunting. I'm sure some of us are in that position right now where we're kind of sitting there looking at all our plans and our work going, oh my gosh, what do I do with this now? But the great news is we don't have to completely scrap it. We can take what we've already planned and, as we mentioned, just tweak it a little bit, maybe integrate some new themes and some new ideas. But before we start looking at the different adaptations that we can start making, we want to go through a little bit of the misconceptions that surround online teaching and remote teaching, and then debunk those and go into how that will apply to your lesson planning for the future.
So we have another little quick poll for you. So we're going to be doing a quick true or false poll. Let me just launch that up for you. So we have 5 different questions. So we want to know what you folks think about online teaching and what the different myths surrounding it are, the facts about it. So we'll just give you a few minutes to put your answers in. Great. So we're just waiting for a few more answers. Perfect. All right. So we'll stop it here. Very good. So here are the results of our poll. So we're going to be going over what this looks like. So
So the first one being, is it easier to cheat online? We were a little divided with this. The answer is, unfortunately, it is true. It is easier to cheat online. With Wi-Fi also comes Google and different things like Wikipedia, where students can look things up and get the answers to that. So how that translates to our lesson plan and how that's going to affect our lesson plan is what we really need to do is switch up the way that we're assessing our students. Instead of going for quantitative assessments where we're doing things like tests and really looking at if they know the answer, we have to switch to a more qualitative way of assessing and look at how they're applying the knowledge of the content. So the way that this could appear is assigning a lot more things like writing, video making, things like that, where we're really looking at the use of the content and not just if they know the answer or not.
Great. So I also wrote in the results in the chat as well. It's all there if ever you wanted to look at them and see how the differences were. So the second one, so student-teacher interaction will be made more difficult. So we had a lot of people think that this was true, and it actually depends. There's no clear answer. So although it is very difficult to replicate the connection that's developed in the classroom, there are different platforms that you can use to hopefully stay connected with your students. So what does this mean for your lesson plan? So again, it really depends on the types of infrastructure that your district has in place, what you're using to teach your students, and the kinds of activities that you have. So you really have to try and make sure to make it, we'll talk a little bit about it later, but just make sure that you have access, use the platforms that you have, and just adapt your lessons according to that. The tools, yeah, absolutely. So these are some different tools that are used. We also have a list at the end of some online platforms that some teachers are using as well. Also, this is being recorded, so we'll be able to put it up on our YouTube after, so you can go revisit it at any moment to go through our webinar again and take a look at the tools. You're welcome.
Great. So the third one was how students do not receive adequate feedback. So for that one, we had most of the people saying false. This is indeed false. We just have to, again, change up how we're giving the feedback. So how this will affect your lesson plan is implementing the different channels and the different strategies and platforms like we had seen on the prior slide to involve the feedback. So for some people, it's going to be over the phone. If you have students who maybe don't have Wi-Fi, I know that is an issue that quite a few of us are facing, is how are we going to reach our students remotely who don't have Wi-Fi? So what we have seen is some schools, districts, and teachers are setting up class hours where they have their business phone being forwarded to their cell phone, and they're able to take calls from the students and the parents and then give the direct feedback that way. There's also other platforms like Zoom, the one we're on right now, where you can actually have the students call in. They don't need a Wi-Fi connection in order to come in. They can call in. They just unfortunately won't have the visual. But again, that just means we'll be able to adapt that if we know ahead of time that that's going to be the case for our students. What is also really important to know is that this is going to be a huge learning curve for all of us. So an integral part of this is going to be receiving feedback from our students as well, and finding out from them what they feel is working, what they feel is not working, how they feel supported, how they maybe feel not supported, and just constantly having to adjust ourselves that way. As teachers, it becomes, or educators, it becomes very second nature for all of us to learn to adapt ourselves and change things on the fly. So in a way, that's going to be one constant for us moving forward, is we're going to continue having to do that.
And number 4, remote learning is easier than traditional learning. So 100% of you said that this was false. And Actually, it is false. So remote learning is just as difficult as in-class learning, if not even more so, because it takes an elevated amount of motivation and focus on the student's part in order to be successful in this. So how this affects your lesson plan, it comes down to the different types of activities that you're going to be assigning to your students. Try and make sure that they are staying engaged. We'll be going a little bit more in detail of what this will look like very soon with a specific example of a lesson plan. So we have to make sure that our students are being successful in this, we have to really adapt the kinds of activities that we're giving to them for the setting that they're in. And for the last one, remote learning is not as effective as in-class learning. So we were really divided on this 50-50, and that's as right as it gets because it really depends. So once again, student motivation, available resources, proper planning, these are only some of the factors that will play a role in this. So how this affects your lesson plan, once again, just making sure that you utilize all the tools available to you and make sure that you implement those into the lesson that you're going to be delivering, whether that's live or whether that's looking a little bit different since your district might not have the infrastructure in place to be able to deliver those live lessons.
Unfortunately, as we've kind of said, a lot of this is going to depend on the program or the platform that you're using. If you folks feel so inclined, if you could let us know maybe what platform you're going to be using, that would be super helpful. That way we can make it more targeted towards what your specific situation is going to be as well.
Yeah, that would be great for sure. And if you have any specific questions about yourself, feel free to shoot them in the Q&A as well, that we can help answer and clear that up for you at the end.
So now we have Samantha, who hopefully after debunking some of the myths surrounding remote teaching and remote learning is feeling better about her lessons and her units moving forward. She's feeling focused, engaged, and ready to take on the task that's ahead of us.
Great.
So we're gonna toss up an example of a lesson now. We'll quickly go over it, but then we'll go into it with more detail. So we have here a lesson about similes that a teacher was going to be using for when they were still in the classroom at school and not doing remote learning. So just to briefly go over it, the teacher was going to have the usual hook. It was going to be very student-centered, very focused on interaction between the students themselves as peers and the teacher as well. We'll go into more depth and read it out once we start really breaking down the lesson. So one thing that we just want to mention to keep in mind as we go is just in the back of your head, kind of think about how can we change this? Would we change this? Are there things that we can keep the same? So some notes about what we would change. A big thing is going to be that we need to adjust our lessons to be much more independent for the students. In a remote setting, everything is going to be done independently, especially for the older students who are maybe in middle school and high school. They'll have much more independence versus some of those that might be elementary school educators. So a lot of the teacher-led parts and a lot of the teacher interactions will have to be removed. Again, depending on the different platform you're using. If you're using something like this where you're still going to be able to have those almost face-to-face interactions with your students, you can keep some of that in. But for the most part, it's going to be about taking things out, replacing the physical games with online games. Another huge thing for independent work that we've seen a lot of teachers using is keeping familiar tasks that they've done in the classroom. This is going to be a huge change for us, a huge change for the students and for the families. So having those familiar tasks will really help to ground themselves in what they're doing and in the future create more independence with them because it's going to be something they're used to doing. They've done it, for the past how many months, and now they'll be able to keep doing that.
And it will help you as well just get used to the new platform that you're using. So I see that Dorley said that she's using a new platform, still in training for this. So this is really important for that as well, just so you can start by keeping your familiar tasks to get you and your students both used to this new platform. Great. And for the time as well, so working remotely will definitely require an adjustment to class times and schedules, as we know this. So much of this will be dependent on the available resources to both you and your students. Again, it's a recurring theme, but just as a general umbrella, so for live lessons, your lessons will absolutely need to be shortened if you're able to deliver those live lessons, because you won't be able to track your students' attention span as you can in an in-class setting. There are a lot more distractions around them. They're at home, they're on their computers, so it's definitely absolutely going to have to be shortened, if not even by half. If you're instead in the position where you're sending in weekly packages to your students, giving them the kinds of work that they have to do, then you really have to make sure that your clear deadlines are outlined in your lesson plan and in the plan that you provide to your students as well. And that way they can take their time working on each assignment, but they know exactly which day they have to give which work, and then they'd be able to learn properly that way. Also, just keep in mind as well that the parents are going through this as well. Parents, most of them are not teachers, so this is all very new to them as well. A lot of them are getting huge packets from a bunch of teachers and they don't know where to start with this. So just try to keep it very clear yet concise for the parents, and just kind of going off of that, if possible, you can set up times within your plan as well for student and parent check-ins. So this can be as easily as setting up a Zoom meeting in advance and then sending this to your parents on which day and which hours they'd be able to call in using their phones to speak with you if ever they have specific questions about the kinds, about how to approach different assignments, and same with your students. So this will be definitely very important to keep the communication between parents, students, and yourself. And also the success of the students' learning will be this will be really important for them as well, if it's something that you're able to set up.
Just to hop in there as well, part of the check-ins, it's a time where you can really touch base with the students in terms of how they're feeling with the situation as well. I think as educators, a lot of us can recognize that while academics is a large part of what we do, there's also a lot of things that go on behind the scenes with our students. For some of our students, our presence might be the only consistency for them, and right now they're not necessarily having that. So having those consistent check-ins will also provide a little bit of a socio-emotional support for them as well.
Great. So just going back to our lesson here, we're going to be taking it bit by bit. So feel free to read through and just let us know in the chat what specifically you would change about this to adapt it for an online setting. So here in our hook, so what is this going to look like? So what we think is that, like we said, we need to make this a little bit more independent. So we have two options. We can either completely remove the hook, since this is not an independent activity whatsoever, or we can change the activity. So for example, we can make an activity where rather than the teacher explaining what the simile is and asking different students to give their definition, rather the students can have this activity where they would blindly write their understanding of what a simile is before the lesson, and then revisit that same piece of paper at the end of the lesson and write what their new understanding of this is. That way they can submit this in order to check for understanding on the teacher's part. And it's an activity that that could be used as a hook, but making it a little bit more independent.
So for the next part, where the teacher would typically display on the smartboard a chart and then come up with a definition of a simile and then provide a few examples, this of course would have to change. You could keep it if you were doing live lessons. However, to keep the students engaged in the work and to keep all students participating, we would suggest still adapting it for online. So what would the adaptation look like? One of the things that you could do is have the students write their own definition, or have the students go online to search for their own photos and write their own similes that they would then submit to you. Since the teacher would not have given them the definition at that point, it would be imperative to make sure that there's examples provided to the students so that they could have a concrete example to look at and always bring things back to that and provide that benchmark for them. In terms of time, if you're doing this online, to us, 10 minutes goes by like this in the classroom. Online, it feels very, very drawn out. We would suggest reducing this to at most 5 minutes, if not faster, especially if you're having them search for the photos online. It's very easy for them to get distracted as they're Googling for pictures and then go off on a little bit of a Google deep dive, and all of a sudden they're looking for similes, and then all of a sudden they're looking at something completely different. So we would say a max of 5 minutes, somewhere between 2 to 5 minutes, depending on the attention span of your students.
So this is for if you're doing a live lesson. So you can do it so it's like a kind of a competition. So you're like, okay, go, I'm giving you 5 minutes to look up 2 pictures, come up with a simile and upload it to our Google Classroom or whichever other platform that you're using. If you're not doing a live lesson, then of course, this kind of activity would be really relative and each student would take their own time with it. And maybe in that case, you can give more than just finding one simile. Then you can say, okay, I want 10 different, make it a longer assignment for the students to complete. So for this one, the next activity, so the teacher hands out a worksheet that, that requires the students to match pieces of a simile together. So how can we change this for an online setting? It's a worksheet, so this can stay the same. However, it would need to be posted prior. And of course, we know that this cannot be done live. You cannot, even if you're giving a live lesson, you can't say, okay, students, now work on your worksheets, please. Instead, you would make it a homework assignment. And this is where clear deadlines is very important in your lesson plans. The students need to be very aware of exactly when they need to hand this in. If you're doing a live lesson, you can, of course, tell them when exactly they would need to hand this in. If you don't have the tools to do so, then once again, just outlining that in your plan. Very good. And this one, so the students in this case will not be able to be put into teams either. So once again, we have to make it more independent. If you're giving a live lesson, you can still keep this a competition, just make it an individual competition instead of a team competition. So for example, if you're using Zoom to give your live lessons, there's a raise hand option. So in that case, you can get the first student to do it that way or write the first chat. Or if you're giving a live lesson where all students are on their cameras and they're speaking, then once again, the first person who answers. So there are different ways to tweak that. Alternatively, if you, once again, if you don't have the tools to deliver live lessons, then you can turn this easily into a homework activity. But once again, change it up. So instead of making it into teams, you can maybe ask your students to take a video of themselves teaching you what a simile is. It would be a very short video and they would just have to upload that onto your platform. And as for time, so once again, this kind of activity would be up to the student's own time if you're doing the homework activity. If you're doing the live lesson, there's no way you're going to draw out an online competition for 15 minutes. We would suggest 5 minutes max and topping it there. You can always change up your activities. So you can add more games, but keep them all very short. So this is really important. Otherwise, the students won't be able to be engaged.
So for the closure of our lesson, we would not be able to read a picture book and locate the similes throughout that. Again, unless you were using a platform where you had the face-to-face option. I believe from what I've seen online, not a lot of schools are necessarily using a platform that allows face-to-face. So we really want to concentrate on something where you're going to have to completely adapt that. So you also would not necessarily be able to play a simile search game or have a timed individual simile game as well. So the ways that you can change this is for reading the picture book and locating the similes. You could provide online games for them instead. Alternatively as well, something that I used to always enjoy doing in the classroom is having the students make a video of themselves, sometimes teaching a math equation to the other students. A lot of learning happens when they're taking on that teacher role. So for this, you could also have them make a video of themselves reading a picture book and locating the similes of that, and then they send that into you. As I mentioned, there's the online games. For those that do not have Wi-Fi, you could ahead of time make a physical game. For an example, specifically with similes, you could make kind of like those memory games where there's one part of the simile on one card and the second part on another one, and they have to find them, remember where the second half is, and match them together. And then for a timed individual game, again, in this case, time isn't necessarily applicable. If they're doing the physical game, they could play it for as long as they want, as many times as they want. If you're doing online games, same thing, they could play it for as long as they want.
So of course, in this case, these aren't really things that you'll be able to track yourself. But at some point, we really have to allow the students to take their own learning into their own hands. So you just really have to be able to trust them with this and be aware that you're providing them with resources to help them if they need it. This wouldn't be a mandatory activity. So this is really up to your discretion if it's something you want to offer, especially for the physical game. We recognize it's a lot of work, but it really depends on what you already have ready and what kinds of resources that you have available to you.
We're in this situation, unfortunately, going to have to relinquish a lot of the power that I know I personally struggle with. So some things that you could do is you could send home homework trackers or activity trackers and put that trust in the students if they're old enough, or in the parents to really fill out and then send back to you as a way to best kind of track what they're doing and how much time they're spending, and also to just make sure that they're doing the work that they need to do. So we wanted to make note of some more resources. We'll leave this up for a little bit so you folks can kind of take note of them, but there's lots of things like Google Classroom, Edpuzzle, Flipgrid, Zoom, Notes, Rediker, Plus Portals, Noodle Tools, Paper. Some of these are free, some of them are not free. Right now is hopefully a good opportunity where you can make note of what you might be interested in and then research it a little bit, see how you could apply it to what you're currently using and the current lessons that you're going to be doing with your students.
And some of these as well, your district may already be offering to all teachers and students in any case. So for those that are partnered with different districts, these are all great tools to be able to use. And some of these, of course, are to give lessons. Some of them are more to do activities. So they're all a little bit different, but we highly suggest to look into these different platforms and take a look at which ones you think would best fit your needs at the moment. So that brings us to a wrap. We don't have any questions in the Q&A at the moment, but we're going to leave this up for the next few minutes. Those who need to go, feel free. Those who want to stay and ask some questions, feel free.
As we give you time to possibly type in some questions, we're just going to talk briefly about what's upcoming for our webinars that we're going to be doing every single week. So next week, we're going to be focusing on classroom management online and how that's going to look. It, of course, naturally will be very different versus how it looks in the physical classroom. And then future topics, just to give a little bit of a preview as well, will be how to keep our students motivated online, how to make sure that we're taking the proper self-care during this stressful time. You can check back at our blog, blog.paper.co. That's where we'll post the registration links, and that's also where we'll let you know what that current themes week is.
We'll be posting them every Monday. You will be able to find us on the Eventbrite as of Wednesday of the week before. So this will be tomorrow for next week. But we will be posting on our blog every Monday for that week. So next Monday, we will be posting for our classroom management webinars on that week. So we have a question here in the chat. Yeah, Lisa, did you want to add anything before?
I was just going to point out the question as well, and you're already on it.
Well, all right. So we have a question here that says, you mentioned how important it is to communicate with parents. Any tips for dealing with parents who are more absent? That's an excellent question. And in terms of myself, there's not, I don't think there's much of a way that you can. You really have to be able to trust. This is a really tough time for all of us. And in this case, students are going to need to be very independent in taking control of their own learning. So this is definitely going to be a very big milestone. Did you want to add?
That of course would be where the check-ins will come in. As many check-ins as you can possibly handle would be fantastic for the students, and getting that feedback from the students as well, since we may not be getting the feedback from the parents. So that's where the open line of communication is really going to come into play. I see we have another question about assessment and grading. That's a great question. As we mentioned a little bit earlier, that's where we're going to have to kind of change the way that we're assessing people and the way that we're grading them as well. So instead of looking at the answers, we're going to have to look at how they're using it. So it'll be a matter of changing out maybe the activities that we do with them. And also maybe providing yourself a little bit more time than we typically would to follow through with the assessments and provide the grades as well. It's going to be a huge learning curve that we're going to have to navigate as a group together. In terms of some concrete examples of what you could do for changing the assessment and grading, depending on the age level. I'm not sure if you have a younger age level or an older age level, but I would really suggest assigning a lot more writing. The great thing about that is, in order for students to become better writers, they have to write. So they're going to have that opportunity now. So you're going to have to possibly assign more writing, and then go through all of that and provide that feedback with them as well. There's some of the platforms too, like Google Docs, where you can have them typing and you can even give them the feedback in a live session so that they're getting it in the moment as much as possible, similar to in the classroom.
Great. So before we go, are there any more questions?
The
Yeah,
call-in,
absolutely.
yeah.
So every time, so we have a question that says, can you tell more about the call-in feature with Zoom? So every time that you make a Zoom meeting, so you're gonna have to make a Zoom account, it is free. So you can make a Zoom account and then schedule a meeting. When you do that, you will have in your description automatically a number that students will be able to call, and it will be set up based on where they're calling from. I believe they give two numbers, whether it's Canada or US. I'm not 100% certain on that, but they give at least two numbers depending on where you're calling from. And then you can use that number from any phone to call in at that time, and it will call into your meeting. At that point, though, you will have to have started your meeting. So the scheduled time of your Zoom meeting, you will have to be inside. So in terms of the student check-ins, this is where I mentioned that. So you just set up specific times, kind of like an office hours, where you would have it open. You can do your own work while you have it open, and then if ever somebody calls in, you can help them. Or if you're delivering live lessons, you can do the same thing. Just make sure that your students know exactly at what time to call in, and of course, keep in mind that they won't have the visual aspect to it. Does that answer your question?
It's also a way that you can use to integrate class discussions as well. So perhaps you've maybe assigned them to read a certain chapter in a book, and you want to then have a class discussion about that chapter as you typically would in the physical classroom. They can call in or video conference in, and they can still have that. So there is a bit of a way that you can kind of involve group work that in that manner. And it's just, kind of going with the flow for it.
All right, so that brings it to a wrap. Thank you everybody so much for attending today. If there are any more questions, please feel free to email either Lisa or myself. I will be writing, there is my email, and Lisa's is the same thing, just with her name instead of mine. So feel free to email us with any other questions that you may have, and we hope to see you next week.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.